He preferred the night shift because there were fewer people, less noise. Only the hardcore bodybuilders and underground fighters came at those hours. And if they knew who he really was, they would never act so casually around him. Because this old man wasn't just cleaning the gym. He had once cleaned up the world, but now, at 11:30 p.m., with a spray bottle and microfiber cloth in his hands, he looked like he had never pulled a trigger in his life. Nobody knew the name Frank Richardson. On the payroll sheet, it just said, F. Richardson, night cleaning. He was 68 years old, medium height, with slightly hunched shoulders of an ordinary man. He had a slight limp in his left leg and was missing his pinky finger on his right hand. These were assumed to be just signs of aging, but nobody knew that the limp was from shrapnel fragments he took in Helmand Province, and the missing finger was lost while disarming an IED in Fallujah. The gym took on a different atmosphere at this hour of the night. Instead of daytime music, heavy metal played, and neon lights created harsh shadows. The people who came here were different too. There were no office workers who came after work to walk on the treadmill for half an hour. Instead, there were men with tattooed arms, burly types who worked as bouncers at nightclubs, and muscular young men whose names you didn't ask. Frank enjoyed observing them because he could read each one's body language like an open book. The kid doing heavy bag training in the corner, probably in his 20s, probably grew up on the streets. He was holding his punches in the right position, but his feet were at the wrong angle. These weren't techniques taught in the military, more like street fighting reflexes. Frank could even guess which neighborhood that kid grew up in just by watching his movements. The bald man doing bench press on the right side was completely different. His movement was disciplined. His breathing was perfect. And Frank could tell he was a former security officer. Maybe police, maybe private security, but whatever unit he was from, this man had once carried a weapon. Under his watch strap was a small tattoo, most likely a unit number. Frank sprayed the machine with detergent and began wiping. His hands were on autopilot, having done the same movement thousands of times. But his eyes never stopped. He constantly scanned every corner of the gym, every entrance and exit, every potential danger point. This was a habit, a 30-year-old reflex, a skill he acquired during his years in Afghanistan, necessary for survival. Nobody really knew why he chose this night shift. The money was a bit better. Of course, there was a night shift premium. But the real reason was different. Most of the people who came at night were like him. People with secrets in their past. People who couldn't find a place in the daytime world. People who could only feel comfortable in the dark. It was easier to understand them, and they found it easier to understand him. There was a silent solidarity between them. Nobody asked questions. At 12:15 a.m., 3 more people entered through the door. Frank immediately noticed them because they had never come to the night gym before. They were between 25 and 30 years old, wore expensive sportswear, and had aggressive attitudes. Especially the blonde kid walking in front was looking around as if challenging everyone. Frank knew this type. Rich family's kid. No street fighting experience, but thinks he's tough. These kinds of people were the most dangerous because they didn't know their own limits. The blonde kid went to the straight bench and started loading weights. Normally, Frank would approach him and remind him of the safety rules. You needed someone with you when lifting heavy weights during night hours. But tonight, something was different. The kid's friends were wandering around left and right, acting as if they were exploring the place. This reminded Frank of the old days, the behavior of soldiers doing reconnaissance in enemy territory. He took the microfiber cloth and started wiping the mirrors next to the treadmill. From this position, he could see the entire gym, and nobody noticed that he was observing. This was a skill he learned during years of covert operations, being invisible, staying in the background, but being able to control everything. The bald security officer had noticed the same thing. Frank could see that his eyes were tracking the newcomers. Former police and soldiers had a common trait, being able to sense potential trouble in advance. And tonight, trouble had walked through the door. Interestingly, nobody had noticed this tension yet. The kid doing bag training was still hitting, the music was still playing, the air conditioning noise was still at the same level. But for Frank, The environment had completely changed. He felt like he was in a battlefield. Every sound clearer, every movement more meaningful. He knew this feeling. It had been the same in Afghanistan. The silence before an operation. Everyone continued their normal lives, but actually, a storm was approaching. Frank set aside the spray bottle and walked toward the towel station. Apparently, he was just reorganizing the towels. But actually, he was measuring the distance between the blonde kid and his friends. Now you're starting to wonder too, aren't you? Why is this ordinary janitor so careful? Why is he analyzing every detail? Write in the comments which city you're watching from, and guess where this story is going. Because the real surprises are just beginning. At 12:45 a.m., the incident happened. While the blonde kid was doing bench press, the weight fell on him. And at that moment, the entire atmosphere of the gym changed. The bald man immediately ran to help, but the blonde kid's friends pushed him away. This pushing wasn't just physical, there were racist slurs too. Frank realized at that moment that this wasn't a coincidence. The bald man had been deliberately chosen as a target. The fight erupted in an instant. The blonde kid's friends attacked the bald man, and the gym turned into chaos. Frank had only been observing until that moment, but now he needed to act, because this wasn't just a fight, it was an organized assault, and Frank Richardson knew such situations very well. The first attacker came from the right, to corner the bald man, the second from the left, the third from the front. Frank immediately noticed this coordination, because he had applied the same tactic in Kandahar, surrounding the enemy, cutting off escape routes, and then neutralizing. Only now the enemy was the bald security officer, and the attackers were the blonde kid and his friends. The bald man fought well. Frank had to admit that. He had former police or military training for sure. He was throwing his punches to the right places, maintaining his balance, and protecting vital points. But 3 against 1, and the young men weren't empty-handed either. Even if they weren't professionals, they had numerical superiority. Frank pushed his cleaning cart toward the scene. Apparently he was just an old janitor trying to clean up the mess. Nobody noticed that he was strategizing, evaluating escape routes, or identifying each attacker's weak points. This was 68 years of experience in staying invisible. The blonde kid, probably the leader, approached the bald man from behind with an iron bar in his hand. Frank recognized this scene because he had experienced something similar in Mosul. Attack from behind, approach silently, and strike at the critical moment. Only then Frank was unarmed. Now he only had a microfiber cloth in his hand. At that moment, Frank made his decision. Everything he had learned over 30 years, every reflex, every tactical knowledge kicked in, because this wasn't just a gym fight anymore. This was a familiar battlefield for him, and Frank Richardson never lost on the battlefield. He pushed the cleaning cart until he reached the blonde kid. The kid didn't even look at Frank, only seeing an old and harmless janitor. This was what Frank wanted. The enemy not seeing you, not perceiving you as a threat. This was a truth he had known since Vietnam. As the blonde kid raised the iron bar, Frank moved. He didn't actually move. He flowed like water behind the kid. He placed his left hand on the kid's wrist, gently. A very light touch, as if he was trying to maintain balance. But this touch was at such an angle that the kid's hand became paralyzed. The iron bar fell to the ground. While the blonde kid was trying to understand what happened, Frank had already made his next move. He pressed 2 fingers of his right hand to a specific point on the kid's neck. The kid fainted and fell to the ground. This entire movement took 3 seconds and nobody understood what had happened. Frank immediately took the cleaning cloth and knelt beside the blonde kid, as if he was trying to help him. The other attackers saw their friend suddenly collapse, but didn't realize this was done by the old janitor. They thought the kid had somehow fainted. The second attacker ran toward Frank, probably to push him down and knock him to the ground. Frank stood up while seemingly losing his balance and stumbling. But this stumbling was so calculated that he tripped the attacker's leg. The man fell and hit his head on the weight bench. This wasn't a coincidence either. It was the result of Frank's 30 years of experience. The third attacker stopped, He was watching two of his friends become neutralized in an instant and trying to understand. Meanwhile, the bald security officer also recovered and began assessing the situation. Frank gave him an eye signal. A very brief signal. The bald man understood this signal because he was also a former soldier. People in other corners of the gym thought the fight was over. The kid doing bag training turned off the music. Others approached. But there was silent communication between Frank and the bald man. Both knew that this incident wasn't over yet, because two more people entered through the door. They looked older, more experienced. Frank immediately analyzed them and understood that these were professionals, military veterans, probably private security, or mercenaries. They had come to turn this situation into team play, reinforcement support. Frank put the cleaning cloth in his pocket and walked toward the older men. His attitude was still the same, just an old employee trying to do his cleaning. But his walk had changed. His steps were quieter, his posture straighter. The soldier inside was awakening, and this time, he wasn't hiding. The two older men looked at Frank and didn't sense anything. Frank understood from their eyes what they were looking for. Who had neutralized their young friends? Who was the real threat? But Frank was still the invisible man, still just a janitor. The first older man focused on the bald security officer. His assessment was correct. The bald man was indeed a former professional, but he didn't know where the second threat was coming from. Frank would use this advantage because the surprise factor was always the strongest weapon. At this point, everyone understood that they were now in an open battlefield. The music had stopped, other people exercising had moved aside, and there was electric-like tension in the atmosphere. Frank knew this atmosphere very well. He had experienced it many times in Iraq. He recognized this feeling. It had been the same in Iraq. The silence before an operation. Everyone was continuing their normal lives, but actually a storm was approaching. Frank set the spray bottle aside and walked toward the towel station. Apparently he was just reorganizing towels, but actually he was measuring the distance between the blonde kid and his friends. The second older man took something out of his pocket. Frank immediately saw what it was, but nobody noticed. It wasn't a knife. It wasn't a gun either. Something more dangerous. A small injection device. These men's purpose wasn't to kill. It was to kidnap someone. And the target was probably the bald security officer. Frank was now completely under the control of his old reflexes. The Special Forces lieutenant from 30 years ago had returned. Every tactic he learned in Iraq, survival technique, and war strategy had kicked in. Because in this situation there wasn't an ordinary gym fight. There was an organized kidnapping attempt. And Frank Richardson, former covert agent of the Department of Defense's classified operations, tracking war criminals, would stop this operation. The first older man moved toward the bald security officer. Frank positioned himself to intervene, because this wasn't just about one person anymore. This was about justice. The same justice he had been seeking for 30 years. If you're wondering where this story is going, like the video and share your guesses in the comments. Who do you think this old janitor really is? And what's behind this fight? The injection device approached the bald man's neck. Frank moved at that moment. Not like an old janitor, but like the special operations veteran he once was. Because 30 years later, Frank Richardson's war had found him again. He grabbed the device from the man's hand with a move that looked simple, but was actually the result of years of training. The man turned in surprise, but Frank was already behind him. A single pressure point on the neck, and the second attacker was also neutralized. Now only the first older man remained. He looked at Frank, and for the first time saw the real threat. In Frank's eyes was the coldness of someone who had survived 30 years of covert operations. The invisible man was invisible no more. The man backed toward the door, but Frank was already between him and the exit. There was nowhere to run, because Frank Richardson controlled the entire battlefield. Just like in Baghdad, just like in Tikrit, just like in every operation where he had survived. And this time, justice would not escape. Frank had completely dropped the mask now. After 30 years, the veteran of covert operations in Iraq was taking the stage. When the second older man pulled out the injection device, Frank knew what it was. A ketamine-based drug. A professional tool used to sedate and kidnap the target. These men weren't just street thugs. They were members of an organized crime syndicate. The bald security officer had also understood the seriousness of the situation. When he and Frank made eye contact, they were both thinking the same thing. This wasn't a coincidence. They had been tracking the bald man, planning to capture him here, and Frank's presence had disrupted this plan. Frank slowly approached the man with the injection device. He took the cleaning cloth in his hand, as if he wanted to wipe bloodstains, but in reality, this cloth would be used for a technique he learned 30 years ago. During Iraq operations, a method he used to silently neutralize enemy sentinels. The second older man didn't notice Frank. His eye was on the bald security officer, and he was preparing the injection device. Even if he saw Frank approaching, he would only perceive him as an old man doing cleaning. This was Frank's biggest advantage. Nobody saw him as a threat. Frank stopped 3 meters from the man. His old reflexes had kicked in, and he was no longer the retired janitor bearing the Richardson family name, but Special Operations Commander Frank Mitchell. Yes, Richardson was a fake surname. His real identity had been hidden for 30 years because the operations he conducted in Iraq were still classified information. The man with the injection device approached the bald security officer. Frank calculated this distance, counted the steps, and waited for the most appropriate moment to intervene. He was using the patience techniques he learned in the Fallujah operation. Wait, catch the right moment, and finish with one move. At that moment, the bald security officer looked at Frank and saw a familiar expression in his eyes. He had seen this expression before, in Iraq operations. This man wasn't just a former police officer. He was also an Iraq war veteran, and he was probably beginning to understand who Frank was, because Frank Mitchell's name was known by everyone familiar with Iraq operations. The covert unit tracking war criminals, infiltration operations with fake identities, rescue of missing persons. Frank had been involved in all these operations and had become a legend. The man with the injection device made his move. He ran toward the bald security officer and attacked, aiming the device at his neck. Frank intervened at that moment. He threw the cleaning cloth at the man's wrist, at exactly the angle he intended. The cloth caused the man to drop the device, but Frank wasn't finished yet. 30-year-old muscle memory kicked in, and he moved behind the man, instantly neutralizing him with a chokehold technique. This technique was the silent elimination method he learned in Tikrit. The man fainted, but wasn't injured. The first older man, seeing his partners collapse, understood that there was a serious threat here, but he still couldn't identify the threat. He looked at Frank, only seeing an old janitor, but this janitor had just neutralized a professional operator in a few seconds. Frank stood up. His posture had completely changed. He no longer had hunched shoulders, no limp either. He was no longer playing the role he had maintained for 30 years. The man across from him saw a familiar expression in Frank's gaze. Fear. The bald security officer approached Frank and spoke in a very low voice. He said just one word. Mitchell. Frank turned to him and nodded slightly. After 30 years, his real identity had been revealed. And this wasn't good at all, because Frank Mitchell was supposed to be dead. In official records, he was reported missing near Fallujah in 2003 and declared dead. But in reality, he had been involved in such sensitive operations that he had to change his identity. He started living as Frank Richardson and had hidden his real identity for 30 years. Now, in this gym, his secret identity had been exposed. And this meant there were people who had tracked him here. The organized crime syndicate wasn't just targeting the bald security officer. They were also looking for Frank Mitchell. The first older man pulled out a phone from his pocket. Frank knew what he was going to do, call for backup. This operation was much bigger, and Frank found himself in the middle of a trap. But those who set the trap didn't know that Frank Mitchell was still alive and hadn't lost his 30 years of experience. Frank took the phone from the man's hand, so fast that the man couldn't understand what happened. He dropped the phone to the ground and crushed it with his foot. But he knew this would only buy time. This operation was planned, and backups were probably on the way. Other people in the gym didn't understand what was happening. They only saw an old janitor suddenly start acting like a superhero. But for Frank, this was a real survival struggle. The bald security officer approached Frank and spoke in a low voice. "I know you, Commander. We worked together in Baghdad. I'm David Walsh, Army Intelligence." Frank remembered him. He was a young intelligence officer then, now aged and bald, but his eyes were the same. This meeting wasn't a coincidence. Those tracking David might not have known about Frank's presence, but now they did. And the information that Frank Mitchell was still alive would create an earthquake in the organized crime world. The first older man was still standing, but no longer trying to attack. He was beginning to understand Frank's identity and was scared. Frank approached him and made eye contact. He gave the final warning he used to give his enemies 30 years ago. "Leave and never come back." The man left. He ran out of the gym. But Frank knew this was just the beginning. His identity was now exposed, and his 30-year secret life had ended. War had found him. At this point in the story, write in the comments what you think. Were you surprised when Frank's real identity was revealed? Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and support this channel, because the story's finale will be much more surprising. David Walsh turned to Frank. "Commander, they were looking for you. The Iraq files are still open, and they're trying to silence witnesses. You're the most important witness." Frank understood. After 30 years, Iraq war crimes had come after him. But this time, not just for justice, but also to hide the truth. And Frank Mitchell would no longer remain silent. The door opened again. 5 more men entered, all armed, all professional. Frank recognized their leader immediately, a tall man with a scarred face. This man seemed to know Frank because he walked straight toward him. The tall man spoke. "Frank Mitchell, we've been looking for 30 years. The Iraq files need to disappear. You'll disappear with those files too." Frank understood this wasn't personal vendetta. These men were trying to protect war criminals. Even after 30 years, the dirty work of the Iraq wars continued, and the evidence Frank had found still threatened some people. But Frank Mitchell hadn't just been hiding for 30 years. During this time, he had thought, planned, and prepared, because he knew this day would come. The Iraq files would eventually surface, and then his real identity would be revealed. Frank Mitchell was face to face with his real identity after 30 years. David Walsh's words reminded him of everything. The Iraq operations, missing civilians, tracking war criminals, and finally having to change his identity. But now the past had found him, and he could no longer continue playing Frank Richardson. The gym had fallen into silence. 3 unconscious men on the floor, broken phone pieces, and the tense atmosphere of 2 old men looking at each other. The young man doing bag training had frozen by the music system. Other athletes were trying to understand what had happened. The man they thought was just a janitor had suddenly transformed into a professional warrior. Frank took something from his cleaning cart. Nobody saw it, but David noticed. A small device, GPS tracker and emergency communication tool. One of the old devices he had been hiding for 30 years, prepared for emergencies. Because Frank Mitchell had never really retired, he had just gone to sleep. David spoke in a low voice. "Commander, do you understand the seriousness of the situation? The Iraq files have been reopened. The International Court of Justice is looking for new witnesses. You're the only living witness who was in that operation. These men came to silence you." Frank was aware of this. The operation he conducted near Fallujah in 2003 didn't exist in official records, but in that operation, he had found mass graves, recorded evidence, and identified the identities of war criminals. This information had remained secret for 30 years because Frank was thought to be dead. Engine sounds came from the door. Backup was coming. Frank expected this because such operations were always done in layers. If the first group failed, the second group would take over, and Frank and David were now in the middle of the trap. The tall man with the scarred face spoke. "Frank Mitchell, 30 years we've been searching. The Iraq files must disappear. you'll disappear with those files. Frank understood this wasn't personal vendetta. These men were trying to protect war criminals. Even after 30 years, the dirty work of the Iraq wars continued, and the evidence Frank had found still threatened certain people. But Frank Mitchell hadn't just been hiding for 30 years. During this time, he had thought, planned, and prepared, because he knew this day would come. The Iraq files would eventually surface, and then his real identity would be revealed. Frank took something else from his cleaning cart: USB drive. All the information he had protected, backed up, and stored in safe places for 30 years was here. The mass graves in Fallujah, names of war criminals, evidence, photographs, everything. He gave the USB to David and whispered, "Get out the back exit. Deliver it to the International Court of Justice." It waited 30 years. Now it's time. David tried to protest, but Frank signaled him. This was Frank's decision. He had been silent for 30 years. Now it was time to speak, and whatever the cost, he would pay it. The struggle began. Frank was fighting alone against 5 people, but he was using every technique he learned in the Iraqi mountains. Despite 30 years passing, muscle memory was intact. Every move was calculated. Every attack was effective. The tall man was the last one remaining. Frank approached him and looked into his eyes. There was fear in this man's eyes, because he was facing the legendary Frank Mitchell. He was no longer that young lieutenant from 30 years ago, but an experienced and determined man. Frank said only one thing to him: "Fallujah will not be forgotten." And the struggle ended. Police sirens were approaching. Frank waited for them. He would no longer hide, because hiding time was over. The Frank Richardson identity was now left behind. Frank Mitchell was seeking justice. When police arrived, Frank raised his hands. He would no longer fight because his fight was complete. The Iraq files were now safe, and the truth would come out. At the end of this story, write in the comments what you think. Are real heroes always those who wear uniforms? Or are they people who seek justice in the guise of janitors? Don't forget to follow this channel and support such stories, because life's most powerful stories are lived in silence. Frank was arrested, but he no longer cared. After 30 years, the voices of innocent people in Fallujah would be heard, and Frank Mitchell would finally find peace.